Hello, a very warm good evening to all of you and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to the third session for the portion of Environment Ecology in our Conquer Prelims series, where today we shall be focusing upon the important conventions, global actions and events which have been shaping towards the conservation of biodiversity and climate action, which generally is one of the focus areas of UPSC. In the past two sessions, we have covered the protected areas in news, the species in news, and today we shall be taking up for discussion with the help of the questions those areas associated with national legislations, associated with the global conventions, which have remained in news somewhere or the other in the past 12 to 18 months. So, with that, let us initiate the discussion. But before that, one thing I want to convey is that regardless of whatever stage your preparation is in, prelims is all about self-confidence and mental conditioning. The better you are used to tackling the questions, the language of the questions, better you will be able to solve those unexpected type of questions that UPSC throws at you. So that requires practice, practice and practice. So that is why, keeping that in mind, we are coming up with the most authentic and representative prelims mock test series. So that is Unacademy All India Prelims Mock Test, UAIPMT. So do appear for this mock test. The questions have got a diverse mix of areas associated with static, areas associated with current affairs. Now, initially you might feel some hesitation that I need to prepare more, I need to study more, then I will appear for it. But please understand, this can be a very vital source for the addition of content. And here, we have set up standard questions representative of the prelims both for GS as well as for the CSAT paper. The exam time and the test time has also been conditioned, keeping in mind the time of the prelims examination. The end of this particular paper, the discussion of the paper shall be conducted live by the top educators, so that not only can you be able to eliminate the mistakes that you are committing, but at the same time add on to your existing knowledge set. Having said that, let us initiate the discussion for today and let us start with the first question of the day. The first question is, World Wildlife Day is celebrated on 3rd of March to coincide with the establishment of which of these conventions? So which of these conventions, they mark an important day, and to commemorate that day on 3rd of March, we celebrate the World Wildlife Day. Convention on Biological Diversity, Convention on Migratory Species, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and World Wildlife Fund for Nature. So which of these had been set up, had been established, due to which we still commemorate that day, we still hold that day to be important, and we celebrate it as the World Wildlife Day here? So basically, here the answer is, basically, most of you have given the correct answer. So the answer here is CITES, that is Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. It is this particular convention which was set up on 3rd of March, and commemorating that, we celebrate that day till today. Okay, there are certain days like that. For example, 5th of June is still celebrated as the Environment Day. Now, what was important on 5th of June? 5th of June commemorates the conduction and the hosting of the Stockholm Conference, right? So just like 3rd of March, you have 5th of June. That is also important. Now, 5th of June commemorates the Stockholm Conference. When was the Stockholm Conference held? So this Stockholm Conference was held in 1972. So all the various climate actions that you observe, that is basically driven from this Stockholm Convention. The conservation of wildlife, the conservation of biodiversity, all of that is basically having a lineage from the Stockholm Conference. Now, when we talk about CITES, what is this CITES? So for a long period of time, it had been understood, and there was an increased awareness that the trade in various different body parts and the endangered species in themselves, that is driving many of these endangered species of animals and plants to the brink of extinction. Now, if somehow that trade would be curbed, then accordingly we could conserve those species. So for that purpose, you had the formation of CITES. Now, for example, let's suppose when you consider the parts of the tiger skin, etc., when you consider the tusk of the elephants, these are some of the frequently traded items in the illegal market. So the CITES was formed in order to put a curb to that. So basically, if you take a look at CITES, it is an international agreement between the governments. Now, this statement is important. Why? A multi-statement question can also be framed that this was just an agreement between the government, civil society organizations, etc. So that is where you have to differentiate it. Now, what was the aim? To curb the international trade. Now, it was drafted as a result of a resolution in 1963 at a meeting of IUCN, okay, International Union for Conservation of Nature. Now, IUCN was formed when? IUCN was formed around 1948. And IUCN is also famous for coming out with a red book, where you have the details of the critically endangered species, and so on. So IUCN has always been vital in the studies associated with the conservation of species. Now, it was basically adopted, it was signed on 3rd of March 1973 and came into force in 1975. India has been a member of CITES. Now, another important fact, very, very important for your prelims. Basically, it is administered by, the secretariat is administered by UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme. When was UNEP created? United Nations Environment Programme was also an outcome of the Stockholm Conference 1972. So when you hear about the UNEP, please keep in mind was an outcome of Stockholm Conference 1972. Okay? So it was formed in June 1972. Since that point of time, it has been active in the conservation of environment. This is a very vital pointer for your prelims. Okay. Now, CITES is legally binding on the parties, but it in itself will not take the place of your national legislation, national laws. So the countries need to frame their own national legislations in order to prevent that illegal trade from happening. Now, has India drafted such a legislation to adhere to CITES? The answer is yes. As a result of this, India, immediately after returning from Stockholm Conference, basically drafted the Wildlife Protection Act 1972, and Wildlife Protection Act 1972 is the one where you have the requirements that trade shall not be carried out, and that is where the species are arranged in various different schedules, and depending upon the criticality in terms of what is the importance of conservation, the species are listed in one particular schedule or the other. Schedule 1 species are provided with the maximum amount of protection. Okay, these are the basics. Now, when we talk about CITES, CITES basically works in the format that the various different species, they are arranged into 3 different appendices. Depending upon the amount of conservation required, they are basically arranged into appendices. So you have Appendix 1, Appendix 2, and Appendix 3. Okay, 1, 2, and 3. So here, the species which are listed in Appendix 1, they are the ones which require maximum conservation. So in case of those species, as we were discussing yesterday also, there is maximum protection provided. Trade is not at all allowed. Having said that, only in cases where, for example, to study a particular species for research activities, in those areas, still a regulated trade is allowed. But before that, you need to take clearance and you need to have the exporting nation taking the onus and the responsibility that the species will be safe in its new location. Okay, so here Appendix 1 lists the species that are more endangered, and here they are threatened with extinction, and CITES prohibits any kind of international trade in any of these species whatsoever. Now, in the case of exceptional cases, that is only for research, trade may be provided or can take place provided that you have an authorization based upon the export and the import permits which are issued. Now, species listed in Appendix 2, for example, when you consider species like Sisam, Sisam is a moist deciduous tree that India has, which has got significant amount of demand in terms of construction for furniture and so on. So that is why Sisam is basically very, very important. So there they are listed in Appendix 2. So here they are now threatened with extinction. Basically, these species as of now are threatened with extinction and may become extinct if the trade is not controlled. Now here what is also important is that look-alike species. For example, let's suppose for a particular species the skin and the fur is in great demand, but poaching that or hunting that species becomes absolutely impossible. So the look-alike, they are also sometimes hunted down and their body parts are then trafficked and traded. So even those kind of species, they are included in the portion of Appendix 2. Now, here international trade in specimens of Appendix 2 may be authorized by granting of an export permit. And then Appendix 3, basically it is a list of species included at the request of a party that regulates trade in the species and need cooperation. What this means, to simplify it, this is the wording of the convention in itself. If you simplify it, let's suppose you consider a species like carousel. Now carousel is significantly on the threat of getting extinct in India. But the same situation is not the case when you consider, let's suppose, West Asia or in the region of, to the western part of India. Their carousel numbers are quite significant. So India needs conservation of carousel. So upon request by India, that can be put under Appendix 3. So those species which are under threat in a particular country but not in other countries, so there it is listed under Appendix 3, right? So to prevent unsustainable or illegal exploitation. Now India has been a party to CITES for very long, since its inception itself. Now when we talk about CITES, the decision to put the species in Appendix 1, Appendix 2 or Appendix 3, now is that permanent? No. A species which is listed under Appendix 1 can be relegated to Appendix 2, can be relegated to Appendix 3, and vice versa action can also be taken. But where does that action take place, or who initiates that action? So that action is initiated by the Conference of Parties. Now, Conference of Parties is the highest decision-making body for any particular convention. Now, in the case of CITES, the COP meeting is held every 2 to 3 years. That is when the COP meeting is generally held. Now, the last time COP meeting was held was in Panama City. It was held in 2022. Now, why that was important was because 2 species were mentioned, another species was also mentioned, but with regards to India. And which were the two species important? First of all, sea cucumber. Now, sea cucumber is a marine organism which significantly helps clear the organic load in the oceans, in the marine areas, and with the excretions, it helps maintain the alkalinity of the oceanic water. So, sea cucumber is very important to control the acidity of the oceans. You would have heard about ocean acidification. So, sea cucumber is a very important marine organism which helps in limiting of this acidity and acidification. That is why sea cucumber is very vital for the marine ecosystem. Now, it has been found out that off the coast of Australia, even in India, off the coast of Tamil Nadu, sea cucumber was becoming one of the largest set of organisms which were being trafficked and which were being traded. So, on the request of Australia, sea cucumber was basically put under Appendix 2 of the convention. Now, there was a relaxation provided for the species of shisham. Shisham is basically what? It is, when we talk about shisham tree, it is a moist deciduous tree. So, it is very, very vital for commercial purposes. And that is why shisham being provided or put under Appendix 2 meant what? It meant that there could not be any trade carried on. There would be restriction in trade for the items crafted out of shisham. So, that was hampering the handloom trade in India. So, upon India's request, as per the COP meeting 19 of CITES, there was a relaxation provided to India whereby there could be some trade which would be carried out, and that was a boost to the handloom sector. Okay, so this is the background, the crisp background for the portion of CITES. The next conference of parties is going to be held in 2025, most probably in Switzerland. That, why do I say most probably, is not because people are unsure about it, but it happens where various countries, they express their interest that we want to host it. If no other particular country is interested, it automatically goes to Switzerland. So that is the case of conference of parties. Okay. Now, coming to the next question, also associated with CITES, this is another kind of framing that UPSC can go for. So here, consider the following statements. CITES, also known as the Washington Convention, is a multilateral treaty between nations. Okay? Owing to practices of smuggling, India has recently been added to the Review of Significant Trade (RST) for red sanders of CITES. And due to weaker legal compliances of regulations, India has been put under Category 2 of CITES National Legislation Program. How many of the above statements is or are correct? A, only one, B, only two, C, all the three, or D, none of the above. So, how many of the above statements is or are correct? First, whether it is known as the Washington Convention or not. Secondly, has India been added to the Review of Significant Trade (RST) due to the smuggling of red sanders, which is quite incessant? And thirdly, that whether India has been put under Category 2 of the CITES National Legislation Program. So here, majority of you have given the incorrect answer. So here basically, let us take a look at the answer. So CITES is known as the Washington Convention. That is true. It was signed in Washington DC in 1973 and is a multilateral treaty between nations, the statement that we just saw. Now, recently there was a review meet, and that review meet of CITES which was held. Now there, looking at the various amendments and changes that India has brought to the Wildlife Protection Act, India was moved from Category 2 to Category 1. and relief was also provided to it, because earlier India was in the category of RST, review of the significant trade of red sanders ever since 2004. Now India has been removed from that particular list owing to the changes and owing to the tightening of norms. So here it is not that India has been put under it, India has been removed from that, and India has been removed from category 2 and has been put under category 1. So how many of the above statements is or are correct? If the answer is only 1, A is the correct answer. Now here, the background of it. So the 77th meeting of the Standing Committee of the Convention, that was held in Switzerland, and the major takeaways. So basically, Wildlife Act. Last year's current affairs, basically you would have observed this, that the Wildlife Act was amended in 2022. And the reason for amendment of the Wildlife Act was to adhere it much more closer to the requirements of CITES, because not only had CITES relegated India into category 2, but previously also India had been put under category 2 because of its failure to implement a tighter legislation and ensure that there is no illegal trade which is happening. Now, what was different this time? So under the new legislation and the new amendment of the Wildlife Act, the schedules of the Wildlife Act now will have a separate portion only for the species listed or threatened under CITES. Then earlier you had 6 schedules, they have now been condensed to 4 schedules. Now as per the requirement of CITES, there will be establishment, and there is deemed to be an establishment of a scientific authority, a management authority, to take a look into the conditions and the knowledge parameter of these wildlife. So these are some of the changes. And why is it that India has been removed from the RST when it comes to red sanders? Is because while red sanders was being smuggled in large numbers for the past year and the past couple of years, India has been tightening the noose against these smugglers, and India has ensured that frequent reporting and frequent ground-based reporting from the government agencies, from the international organizations also take place, which have reported a significant drop in any kind of illegal trade or trafficking. So owing to these positive developments, CITES has basically bestowed upon India again the restoration of category 1 status and has removed it from the RST list. So India was under the review of significant trade for red sanders since 2004, and based on the compliance and reporting, that is why India has been removed from there. Now, when we talk about red sanders, UPSC has already asked you a question from this, but then this remains ever so important because it is one of those species of trees which finds itself in the current affairs every year. So red sanders basically is endemic to the region of Andhra Pradesh. Okay, it is naturally to be found in the Sheshchalam area of the region of Andhra Pradesh. Now, this tree takes a good amount of time in order to mature, sometimes spanning for across 10 to 15 and even 20 years. That is the time taken for the tree to mature. Now, if that tree is cut down and immediately smuggled, the time for regeneration of the forest is not there. That is why the population had been dwindling quite significantly. This particular tree has, again, just for the case of any illegal trade, here also the destination was largely China, Japan as well, because this tree not only has, and the wood of this tree has got some of the aromatic properties and can also be utilized for manufacturing of acoustic musical instruments. Other than this, the furniture made from this tree has got a very high value in the international market as well. So that is why this species has been subjected to threats of illegal harvesting, is listed under Appendix 2 of CITES, and it can be sourced from artificial propagation, and that is what forms the legal export. See, legally if you can export it, Fair enough. But then illegal trade had to be curbed. Now, what was the problem arising when you had India listed under RST was that even that legal trade could not be carried out, leading to a huge financial loss to the various different farming communities. Now, this process enables disciplinary action. So a question can be framed because this was in news. That is why a question can always be framed that what are the implications of a country being listed under RST? So disciplinary action for the countries who don't adhere to the norms of curbing the international illegal trade. And this is a process through which the increased scrutiny is placed on the member nations who are not following the directives of the convention. Now, India was listed in category 2 for the CITES National Legislation Program. Why? Because Wildlife Act 1972 was not stringent enough, was not adherent enough. But the amendment has cleared and paved the way, and India has been put under category 1. So here another question and another topic becomes important from CITES. So what is this CITES National Legislation Program? So when we talk about this national legislation program, it is basically a review and it comprises the various national legislations which the countries have passed in their own territory in order to follow the norms of CITES. So countries must fulfill some of the basic criteria: complete prohibition of illegal trade, penalization of illegal trade, then confiscation of the goods which are traded illegally, and also establishment of a managing authority and a scientific organization. So based upon that, there are 3 categories in which the countries are listed. Category 1, where all the norms of CITES are being followed. Category 2, where some of the norms are not followed. This is where India would lie. It has now been changed into category 1, and category 3 basically not meeting the basic requirements what is associated with CITES. So what is done is that this convention gets in contact with that member state, and according to the review of the various decisions taken by the state, then a state is put under any of these categories. Okay? I hope this is understood. Now, moving on to the next question. Again, in news. Consider the following statements about the Bonn Convention recently in news. The Conference of Parties for the Convention is held every year to decide on the listing of the newer species. The first ever State of Migratory Species report was released at COP14 held at Samarkand in Uzbekistan. As per the report, nearly half of the migratory species are threatened with the declining population. How many of the above statements are incorrect? So Bonn Convention is what? When we talk about Bonn Convention, it is basically Convention on Migratory Species, or CMS, Migratory Species. This was signed way back in 1979. Okay, so that is the other name associated with Bonn Convention. Please don't confuse it with Bonn Challenge. Bonn Challenge is something else. This is associated with Bonn Convention. So here, the first statement. Conference of Parties for the Convention is held every year to decide on the listing of newer species. That is incorrect. The Conference of Parties is held every 2 to 3 years in this case also. Because apply your logic, if this was signed in 1979, by now it wouldn't be the Conference of Parties 14 which would be held, right? You would have more than 30 Conference of Parties which would already have been held. So if it is COP14, means every 2 to 3 years is when this is being held. So the first ever State of Migratory Species report was released. This is correct. As per the report, nearly half of the migratory species are threatened with a declining population. The report indicates that close to around 44% of the migratory species are threatened with a declining population. So this is also correct. So here, how many of the above statements is or are incorrect is what you have to find, and the correct answer in this case will be A, that is only one. What is Bonn challenge associated with? Are we aware of that? Bonn challenge is associated with the control of land degradation, reclamation of land by the nations where the amount of degradation has happened. It aims to achieve land degradation neutrality. Okay, that is associated with the Bonn challenge. Not deforestation, associated with land reclamation and reuse of the land. Very good. So this is why it was in news that CMS COP14 action plans for African Eurasian migratory landbirds, other avian species adopted, and India and Bangladesh, they submitted a joint proposal to list Indian skimmer under the CMS. Indian skimmer is put under which category of IUCN? We'll take a look at it very shortly. But before that, a brief about CMS. So it is an intergovernmental treaty again under UNEP, signed in 1979, came into force in 1983. Here you have two appendices in which the species have been listed. That is Appendix 1, threatened migratory species, Appendix 2, migratory species requiring international cooperation for the process of conservation. Now here, in this particular Conference of Parties, for the first time, State of World's Migratory Birds Report, Migratory Species Report was released. Now, what is important for your examination is which are the bodies, organizations which have taken a part in the release of that report. In the portion of report and indices, that always comes into play. So, UNEP, World Conservation Monitoring Center, BirdLife International, IUCN, and Zoological Society of London. Basically, the report was prepared by the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center, and the data for that was provided by the BirdLife International, IUCN, and Zoological Society of London. So these are the various organizations: UNEP, WCMC, right? BirdLife International. This is a very high frequency area for UPSC to be asking questions. Then after that, IUCN and also Zoological Society of London. Okay? So that is something you have to keep in mind, right? Now, what does the report indicate? The key highlights of the report. First of all, we have already talked about the fact that 44% of the migratory species have indicated a decline in their existing population. More than 1 in 5, that is 22% of the listed species are already threatened with extinction. Around 97% of the migratory fishes are threatened with extinction. So a statement could be framed that more fishes listed under CMS, they are threatened with extinction as compared to the birds or the terrestrial organisms. Now, extinction risk is increasing. Now, the entire prospect of conservation of migratory species works on a basic principle. Here, let's take the example of a key species of bird, migratory species of bird. For example, take the case of sociable lapwing. Now, this is a particular species of bird which is put under which category of IUCN? Here, it is put under which category of IUCN? So, this is a bird naturally found in the region of Central Asia. And it is during the winters when the conditions become very, very difficult in the region of Central Asia, very cold, availability of food becomes difficult. That is when they end up migrating to India and they migrate back. So let's suppose you provide maximum conservation to the species in Central Asia, but in India, if it is hunted and if there is degradation of the natural ecosystem, then this species will start dying, which was the case. And that is why this species of bird is listed under critically endangered. Okay, it is listed as critically endangered species. Okay, keep that in mind. Now, half of the key biodiversity areas listed as important for CMS listed organisms, etc., and 58% of the monitored sites are experiencing unsustainable anthropogenic pressure, human-induced extinction by deforestation, pollution of wetlands, encroachment in the natural water bodies, due to which these species are impacted. Now, coming to the species that was in news, where India and Bangladesh had submitted the request, that is the Indian skimmer. Indian skimmer, why the name skimmer? Because it skims through the region of the water bodies, okay, rivers. Rahul, I want to ask, category and appendix are different. Yes. For which particular portion you want to understand the category? See, when it comes to conventions like CITES, so CITES, CMS, there you use the term appendix. Okay, when we talk about the category in terms of CITES, that is the categorization of nations. Okay, so species are listed under appendices, nations are listed in categories based upon what is their adherence. That is the basic difference. I hope that was the question. If not, please ask again. Now here, this is also a species which is very uniquely known for its beak. Because of that, it is also known as Indian scissors bill. At one point of time, they were to be found in the increased range areas spanning from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Myanmar, China, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, in all those areas. Presently, their population is restricted to the region around India, Bangladesh, and some of the East Asian nations. In India, particularly in the region of the Chambal River Basin, is where you will find increased population of these Indian skimmers. So, as per the IUCN status, they are listed under endangered category. So, they can be sighted near the Chambal River in central India and few parts of Odisha and Andhra Pradesh. Okay? So, I hope this is understood. Please understand, this kind of a comprehensive coverage is required for current affairs. If India has submitted a request for which particular species, and UPSC can ask you a derived question from that species. Eventually, after coming out from the exam hall, when you will search on Google, it will be absolutely saddening, because most of the times you will find it was discussed somewhere in the past year's current affairs. So that is what these sessions are aligned for. Okay. Now coming to the next question, again associated with CMS, and that is, which of these flyways pass through India? West Asian East African Flyway, Central Asian Flyway, East Asian Australasian Flyway, and the Asia Pacific Flyway. Select the correct answers from the codes below. Which of these flyways pass through India? Now, why I say that it is associated with CMS? Because in Conference of Parties 14, conservation of species across the Central Asian Flyway was discussed in significant depth. It was understood that many of the species in that Central Asian Flyway, what is CAF, they are facing that threat of extinction. Now here, what do we mean by flyways? Flyways basically are those particular path or the route which is followed by the migratory species. When suppose a particular bird migrates from Siberia over to India, it is not going to be a free-for-all that the skies are open. Today I will take a path from China, tomorrow I'll take a path from Uzbekistan. They follow a set path, a set pattern. So that is where these migratory birds, the path is important for conservation, because understand, many of the times these migratory species of birds are also the ones which help in pollination of the seeds, spread and propagation of newer species of plants, and so on. So it is very important for maintenance of global biodiversity. That is why conservation of flyways is a must. So here, out of these, majority of you have given the answer which is B. So basically, if you think about it, West Asian East African Flyway passes through India. Central Asian Flyway passes through India. East Asian Australasian Flyway also passes through India. Asian Pacific Flyway, there is no such flyway which is present, which is acknowledged. So 4 is absolutely not there. So here, which are the correct answers? You will have 1, 2 and 3. D, which is the correct answer here. So these are the various important flyways. Out of this, you will basically observe the Central Asian Flyway. If you observe the entirety of the Central Asian Flyway, then if you observe West Asia East Africa Flyway, and also the Australasian Flyway, East Asia Australasian Flyway, these 3 are the ones which pass through India. Conservation of species across the Central Asian Flyway was the one which was talked about. So it covers a large continental area of the Eurasian landmass, and lying between the Arctic in the north and Indian Ocean to the south is where you have the Central Asian Flyway. So it comprises of the migration route of the waterbirds and consists of various countries from Russia to basically the countries in the West, Central Asia, all the way till the region around Maldives. These are few of the species which use that flyway. For example, Asiatic dowitcher, black-necked crane, Indian skimmer, ibis bill, and so on. You have these list of species. Okay, ideally, if you take the look at important ones, sociable lapwing is important, Siberian crane is important, and you have Caspian plover. These are the 5 important species that you can keep in mind with regards to they use the portion of this flyway and they frequent the Indian territory. Okay, moving on to the next question. Consider the following statements about the Minamata Convention recently in news. It operates under the aegis of UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme. India is a party to the convention and has ratified the convention as well. The convention is focused on only the production processes for mercury to ensure absolute zero leakage. Which of the above statements is or are correct? So here, take a look at this. So if you read the statement carefully, you should be able to arrive at the answer automatically. The options here are framed like that. Many of the times you might not know a particular statement of the question. Please do not get into the habit of leaving the question because I did not know a statement. Look at the options here. Options have been framed so that you are able to arrive at the answer easily. So if you take a look at the options here, basically, the convention is focused on only the production process for mercury to ensure zero leakage. This is incorrect, because this convention covers the entire life cycle of the process or production, the consumption and the dissemination of mercury, not only the production process. Production process is also included, but other than that also. So automatically 3 can be eliminated, right? And here you will find that India is a party to the convention and has ratified the convention as well. This is correct. So automatically you can arrive at the answer, that is D. So most of you have given the correct answer. Rahul, you have a question. What is the rule and regulation for category 1 and 2 and appendix? Again, I would specify. Understand and listen to this very carefully, everyone. For CITES, species are listed under appendices. The conditions we have discussed just now. So a species which is absolutely threatened, appendix 1. A species which requires cooperation conservation, appendix 2. Lookalike species, appendix 2. A species which requires conservation in one of these countries, appendix 3. We have already discussed that. That is the appendix. Now, category is for the national legislation program of CITES. It is not for the species. That category listing is done based upon whether a country follows the norms of CITES or not, whether it is violating some of the norms or whether it is not implementing any of the norms. So category 1 nations are those which follow all the norms. Category 2 nations are the ones which do not have that tightest of the control, and the category 3 is who don't follow any of the norms at all. Okay? Please, I hope that this is understood once and for all now. Now this is basically Minamata Convention is associated with dealing with the life cycle for the pollution of mercury. Now associated with this, mercury poisoning leads to what? It leads to the Minamata disease. Minamata disease, which generally influences the young ones and the elder population in significant amount. It is named as Minamata owing to the initial detection of this disease in the Minamata region of Japan. It includes slight issues with the nervous system of the body, where the numbing of the limbs and eventual loss of eyesight, etc. is associated with this disease. So Minamata Convention was in news, and here that is why a question can be expected. UPSC will not ask you a question that associated with exact granular details of Minamata, but an associated area question can be expected. Now, when we talk about sources of mercury pollution, where is it that we get that mercury pollution from? So you have both natural sources as well as the anthropogenic sources. Natural sources, for example, volcanic eruptions, erosion of rocks. These are the natural sources, right? Whenever you have a volcanic eruption, there also in slight amounts along with various other compounds, mercury is also released. Let's suppose it immediately moves into the water body, it can lead to contamination. Otherwise, understand mercury is very volatile. It is not stable in nature. So it quickly reacts. So let's suppose it forms a rock, and over a period of time there is weathering and erosion of that rock. So naturally some trace quantities of mercury can be added in the water body. That is why sometimes you would observe reports, especially in the northwestern part of the country, that groundwater is contaminated with elements and minerals such as cadmium, lead, mercury, etc. How do you get mercury in groundwater? That is because once the groundwater level has been depleted, and then when you extract the water forcibly, that is when some of the traces of the nearby rock portions also come up. And that is when mercury is basically provided. Anthropogenic sources, in the process of extraction of gold, where mercury is made to react and then it is heated so that the mercury evaporates and you have the gold. Cement manufacturing, which is a very vital part, a major part for mercury contamination. That is why in the batching plants, in the construction sector, if that municipal solid waste is not handled properly, mercury contamination and poisoning becomes a real issue. This is also the reason why when you have fly ash, which is emitted from the thermal power plants, there also mercury contamination is a big danger. Now let's suppose you have various different construction waste, etc. If they are not managed properly, then in waste incineration also you will have release of mercury. So it is in these industrial processes where the byproduct which is emitted is mercury. Okay? Now, then moving on to the next question associated with another convention which has remained in news for the past couple of years. Consider the following statements about the Convention on Biological Diversity. India has enacted its own law in order to implement the treaty within its borders. Global Biodiversity Framework is a follow-on to the HE biodiversity targets. Global Environment Facility ensures the funding which is required for this convention. Which of the statements is or are correct? Here. So here most of you are correct. I hope we know about the HE biodiversity targets. Safe limit of mercury should be 0. Mercury in the minutest amount of contamination can lead to mass death of the fishes in that area. So here the correct answer is basically C, that is 1, 2 and 3. Okay, all of them are correct. India has enacted its own law. Which was the law? That was Biodiversity Act. Biodiversity Act 2002. Okay, this was implemented by India in order to adhere to the norms here. Now, when we talk about Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, when was it arrived at? It was arrived as a byproduct of the 1992 Rio Summit. Rio Summit. So this Rio Summit, which was also known as the Earth Summit, is known for the release of 3 important documents and the release and the conclusion of 3 important conventions. You had United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, you had United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, and also you had the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this CBD was formed at that point of time with basically 3 aims. 3 objectives. These are the same objectives that we have for the Biodiversity Act 2002, which was passed in India. So what were the 3 objectives? First was conservation of biodiversity, right? Second was sustainable use. Sustainable use of biodiversity. And third was access and benefit sharing. These were the 3 important objectives. Now here, when we talk about the sustainable use of biodiversity, we talk about modified organisms, genetically modified organisms. For example, a species, let's suppose, has been genetically modified. For example, you have the crossbreed of lion and a tiger, what is liger. Now, these are very heavy species. You cannot simply introduce that crossbreed into the wild. It can basically mean a danger to that introduced species or a threat or a danger to the existing biodiversity. So there also you need to have a sustainable use. And then, for example, if you are utilizing the biodiversity in the region, the local population should be getting the maximum benefits out of it. So that is why access and benefit sharing. So in order to enact these, you had different protocols which were passed. For example, this CBD is associated with 2 important protocols. One is what is referred to as the Cartagena Protocol. Cartagena Protocol. Now, what is this Cartagena Protocol associated with? It is associated with living modified organisms and its sustainable use, what are referred to as LMOs. Organisms, what are LMOs, okay, and its sustainable use. And the second protocol is associated with the access and benefit sharing, what is referred to as Nagoya Protocol. Nagoya Protocol was arrived at the Conference of Party in 2010, which was held in Japan. So this was associated with ABS, or access and benefit sharing. Okay, it was in this Conference of Parties that the convention decided to conserve biodiversity as per a set target. So at this particular Conference of Parties, you had the establishment of HE, biodiversity targets, based upon the region, HE in Japan, based upon that region. So HE biodiversity targets, this was set up. So the aim for this, or the target plan for this, was from 2011 to 2020. You had 5 strategic goals and 20 targets which were supposed to be achieved as per this biodiversity target. 5 goals and 20 targets. This included, for example, conservation of these species from human-induced extinction, protection of these species from invasive alien species. Let's suppose when we talk about conservation, so how do we initiate that dialogue? So mainstreaming the conversation around conservation, that was included in this HE biodiversity target. But after 2020, what would be the global agenda? What needs to be done? So for that, you had to plan out the era after 2020. But in 2020, I hope you are aware that already the world had entered into the era of the COVID pandemic. So the Conference of Parties could not take place. It was listed to be held in Kunming in China. It was in 2021, whereas part of it was held in China, but then owing to the outbreak of COVID, the remainder portion of that meeting was held next year. That was in Canada. So that is where in Conference of Parties 15, you had the COP15 to CBD. That is where the world arrived at the Kunming-Montreal Agreement. Montreal Agreement. Now this Kunming-Montreal Agreement also set up various targets and goals, but here it was known for setting up the GBF or Global Biodiversity Framework. Global Biodiversity Framework. Okay. Now this was to be achieved by the year 2050 with a certain targets set to be achieved by 2030 also. For example, amongst the major targets, if you associate with the targets, one of the targets was Global 30 by 30 target, to bring 30% of the area of the planet under conservation by the year 2030. So that was the 30 by 30 target, right? Ensure the rate of deforestation is reduced to 0 by 2030. Ensure that human-induced extinction is reduced or is eliminated by 2030. Ensure that the extinction which is happening or the threat which is happening due to invasive alien species, that is reduced by 50% by the year 2030. So these were some of the targets. The goals were also similar as compared to HE. The difference being that here for the first time, mobilization of resources from the private organizations, the companies, conglomerates, that was also cited. So this was a kind of a departure. Now here, various different private organizations, they were also set with a framework that, for example, you are coming out with any particular product. Now you have to declare that whether the conservation of biodiversity has taken place or whether you have exploited any portion of the biodiversity. If yes, has the benefit reached the local population or not? So that the companies are also accountable, so that eventually responsible consumption from our side will lead to responsible production, and you can have an efficiency and responsibility towards the environment. Okay, so that is about CBD. Now, then after that, coming to the next question. Consider the following statements with reference to COP28, Conference of Parties 28 of UNFCCC recently in news. It marked the conclusion of the first global stocktake of the world's efforts to address climate change under Paris Agreement. It introduced the concept of global goal on adaptation for enhanced adaptive capabilities of the nations. Which of the above statements is or are correct? So this is where there is a lot of scope to commit mistake. Okay, so be very careful in this. Here, if you take a look into it, so it marked the conclusion of the first global stocktake. This is correct. What is global stocktake? So at the time of Paris Agreement, understand, UNFCCC, we will talk about the genesis, but Paris Agreement was different from the earlier provided Kyoto Protocol in the sense that the countries were asked to set up their own nationally determined contribution to combat climate change. So that meant that countries could set their own targets regarding emission reduction, regarding what they are planning to do in order to reduce the amount of pollution which is, or let's suppose greenhouse gases which are emitted, or the warming that is done. So the countries could set their own target. But whether the countries are achieving that target or not, who decides that? So it is for that global stocktake mechanism was introduced as per the text of the Paris Agreement in itself. Now this global stocktake was supposed to happen after every 5 years. So the Paris Agreement, which was implemented in 2019, came into force in 2019. The text for that global stocktake was finalized in Conference of Parties 28. So this is correct. So the first statement is correct. Second, it introduced the concept of global goal on adaptation. Now, was the concept of global goal on adaptation introduced here? The answer is no. It was introduced basically as a result of the Paris Agreement 2015. That is when the global goal on adaptation was basically introduced. So this is incorrect. So that means that A, 1 only, is the correct answer here. Okay? Now, only 21% of you have given the correct answer in this. So basically, a brief background about UNFCCC. So UNFCCC again formed when? In 1992. Funding agency, GEF, Global Environment Facility, that is the funding agency. Now this was supposed to mitigate climate change by controlling the greenhouse gas emissions. Now here, Conference of Party again is the highest decision-making body, but Conference of Parties happen every year. Happen yearly. Okay? So basically, this Conference of Party, it was, first of all, the first Conference of Party was held in 1995. Then in 1996, it was in 1997 when a protocol followed. So in 1997, you had the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto Protocol was the first such binding protocol to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in order to reduce the amount of emissions. Now, that was a major aspect. It was followed by Doha Amendment. So initially, the planned implementation period of Kyoto Protocol was supposed to be from 2008 to around 2012. But then, as per the Doha Amendment, this was later on extended up till 2020. Now, what could be done or what was supposed to be done after 2020, that is when in 2015, you had the Paris Agreement which was signed. Now, what was the difference? When we talk about the Kyoto Protocol, it worked on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. That is, developed countries which have already emitted a lot more and have developed on the backdrop of these emissions, those countries have greater responsibilities, and you had individual targets given to the developed nations. Targets to developed nations. Countries like India, they were asked to reduce their emissions, but no target was given. In the case of Paris Agreement, there was a departure from this target which was given, in the sense now you had nationally determined contributions declared by each of the country. India, amongst the major economies, was the only country which achieved its NDC as it was declared. Now, nationally determined contribution, what you are doing in order to combat climate change. So there were certain norms which were basically put into place. For example, you have to follow these NDCs. Secondly, in case, let's suppose you have set a target for the year 2022 that I will reduce emission by X amount. The target for 2023 has to be greater. Okay, so there is a progressive increase in the target set by each of the country. Now, how do you analyze whether a country has met its target or not? That is when a global stocktake would be conducted every 5 years. Global stocktake every 5 years. Why? In order to monitor the progress and implementation. Okay? Implementation of NDCs. So it is for this purpose that global stocktake was devised. Now the first global stocktake is supposed to happen this year, but for that the movement had to be initiated last year. Last year only the text was something which was finalized. So global stocktake is scheduled for the first time in 2024. That is why this global stocktake becomes important. Now, it was in Conference of Parties 28, which was held in Dubai in UAE, that multiple various different outcomes, key outcomes were also there. So global stocktake, transition away from fossil fuels. So this included the basic agreement that you have to expand the renewable energy generation by almost 3 times, and the shift away from fossil fuels. The text was finalized. Global goal on adaptation, doubling in adaptation finance, right? This was derived in the Paris Agreement itself. This is the outcome of the Paris Agreement itself. Okay? Monitoring of adaptation needs in the coming years. Explicit 2030 date has been integrated into the text for the target on water security, ecosystem restoration and health. Adaptation. Adaptation is different from mitigation, guys. Both these terms you will find frequently used in the text. Mitigation is what? Prevention of any particular thing from happening. That is mitigation. Mitigation of climate change means that you are preventing climate change. Adaptation is different. That climate change is already happening. How do you empower the population, the biodiversity to tackle that change? That is adaptation. This was a major sticking point in this Conference of Parties, where countries like India, they requested and they raised an appeal that let's shift our strategy from mitigation to that of adaptation. Okay, and here there was a considerable progress on loss and damage fund. Loss and damage fund, which was requested by the countries such as India, Pakistan and all the island nations in the Pacific as well. So, for example, any climate-induced disaster like a cloud burst, like a sudden flood, that can cause lot of disaster, lot of loss of life and property. Now, who is going to withstand those losses? Who is going to compensate for that losses? So that is where a separate loss and damage fund that was being appealed by the nations for a long period of time. Now, it was promised as per Conference of Parties 27, which was held in 2022 in the resort town of Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Now, this year, that is in 2023, that is in Dubai, there was some pledge made by countries such as Japan and some of the other financial institutions, pledge in the tunes of a few millions that was made. It is significantly and grossly inadequate, but nonetheless, it is a starting point. Okay, these are the major outcomes. Now, after that, coming to the next question associated with GEF. Which of these initiatives rely on Global Environment Facility for its funding? Stockholm Convention, Basel Convention, Montreal Protocol. Which of these initiatives they rely upon the Global Environment Facility for its funding process? So here, basically, I hope we have an idea about what is Stockholm Convention, what is Basel. We'll discuss about it. Montreal Protocol, I hope everybody is aware. Montreal Protocol is associated with the prevention of damage to the ozone layer. Montreal Protocol, by the way, is also a follow-up of a particular convention. Which convention was already in place in 1985, which was followed by a Montreal Protocol? That can also be a derived question here. Okay, get me the answer of that while we discuss this. So here, majority of you have given the correct answer. Very good. It was a result of Vienna Convention. Very good. Beautiful. So all of these three basically get their funding from GEF. Other than this, GEF basically also funds the three conventions of the Rio Summit. That is CBD that we have discussed, UNFCCC that we have discussed, and also the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. All these three conventions also have a funding from GEF. Convention to Combat Desertification did not have that funding till around early 2000s, but later on GEF became the partner organization. Now here what you need to understand is that what are these Stockholm Convention and the Basel Convention. So Montreal Protocol we have already established, a follow-up to Vienna Convention 1985. Okay, that can be also a question. Now Montreal Protocol is one of the most successful initiatives by the UN, where you have 193 member countries partnering in that and adhering to that. This was also in news because recently, that is last year, you had a government report which indicated that India has exceeded the targets when it comes to elimination of HCFCs and has completely eliminated one of the derivative of HCFC much earlier than the target which was placed. Now this Montreal Protocol has also been amended multiple times. You have the London Amendment, the Copenhagen Amendment, Montreal Amendment, Beijing Amendment, and the most important of them all, the Kigali Amendment, which was agreed and arrived at in 2016. It is owing to the success of this Montreal Protocol that now ozone hole is close to repairing itself, and it is expected that in the next couple of decades, ozone hole will be completely recovered. Now, a quick review of the Stockholm and the Basel Convention. What is Stockholm Convention associated with? It is associated with POPs, that is persistent organic pollutants. What do we mean by that? Persistent organic pollutants means those pollutants which end up staying in the ecosystem, in the environment for a very long period of time. They don't disintegrate readily, right? So for these POPs, they stay in the environment, so they have to be water insoluble and fat soluble. That is an important characteristic. Why? So let me tell you here, and listen to this carefully. Let's suppose an organic pollutant, you have ingested it with the help of food or any other source, you have ingested it. When you have ingested that pollutant, if it is soluble in water, your digestive system will absorb it and your excretion will eliminate that pollutant from the body. So you are not damaged by that pollutant. But you have certain categories of pollutants which are not soluble in water, but rather they get embedded in the fatty cells. And there they remain for a long time. Hence the name persistent. They stay there for a long time. So this spreads from one species to another. Biomagnification happens, bioaccumulation can happen. And the younger ones, the babies, they are very vulnerable to these POPs, because when they feed on the mother's milk is generally consisting majorly of the fatty cells. And that is when these contaminants, they move from one organism to another. So they continue to stay in that for a long period of time. So this Stockholm Convention was arrived at under the aegis of, and the funding is provided by the Global Environment Facility. Now here, initially 12 chemicals, they were divided again into 3 sets. Right? The classification was done. We'll take a look into that. So the prime objective is to eliminate or reduce the production of POPs such as lindane, chlordiscone, and other such kind of DDT, for example, is another one of those which is used as a chemical into the farmlands, right? So the responsibility for the transitioning economies, the poorer nations who are already relying upon these chemicals. So which is the member organization of UN who is responsible for those? You have UNIDO. Right, United Nations Industrial Development Organization, that is responsible here again. Adaptation is the goal. That how do you adapt to it, and slowly how do you transition your country from that mode of production to, let's suppose, a different production mechanism. Here you have the chemicals divided into 3 annexures: Annex 1, Annex A, Annex B, and Annex C. Annex A basically included the pesticides which form a part of these POPs. Annex B, the industrial production, the industrial chemicals which are used, which are basically again POPs. And Annex C, that in any chemical process, let's suppose there is a byproduct. What is that byproduct? If that is a BOP, then it is provided in that Annex C. That is the classification for Stockholm. Now, what is Basel Convention? When we talk about Basel Convention, it is about the transboundary movement of hazardous waste. For example, you had richer countries of the West transporting the solid waste that they had. Ships, the older ships for dismantling, they would be transported to the poorer nations like Sri Lanka, like India, like Bangladesh, etc. Now, a ship which is no longer functional won't be dismantled, let's suppose, in US or UK, but would be shipped to Alang shipyard in Gujarat. And there, when the dismantling process would take place, asbestos and other such chemicals would be released, which would be harmful for the ecosystem. So in order to prevent that transboundary movement of these waste, that is why Basel Convention was arrived at. So here what is important is that it applies a prior consent approval procedure. That let's suppose a country A wants to transport its waste to country B. It needs a prior informed consent from B. Only then it can transport. Okay. Now here another part important for prelims. Non-parties to the Basel Convention cannot transport hazardous waste and to and from each other unless specially agreed upon. Right? Non-parties, they cannot trade in this. Then member nations are required to have domestic legislation. We have also devised a domestic legislation in 2016. That was the Hazardous Waste Transboundary Act of 2016, which was passed in order to enforce this. It ensures that member nations control the generation, storage, transshipment of these hazardous waste. Which is the waste that we are talking about? We are talking about biomedical and healthcare waste, used oil, used lead acid batteries, chemicals and pesticides, PCBs which are used in many of the devices nowadays, chemical waste generated from industries and consumers. Other than that, electronic and e-waste, they are also covered. Ships destined for dismantling, mercury and asbestos waste, and illegal dumping of other hazardous waste, that is included. So this is relevant for your prelims, that whether e-waste is included in this or not. Okay? I hope this is understood. Yes, pesticides and industrial waste to some category are included in Rotterdam Convention also. Right? Now, after this, moving on to the next question. With reference to the recently passed Forest Conservation Amendment 2023, consider the following statements. The state government requires prior approval of the central government to assign any forest land to a private entity. It prohibits setting up of zoos within the forested area. It ensures conservation by limiting the set of activities allowed in the forest land. So take a look at the options and get at the correct answer. So here the question is that how many of the above statements is or are incorrect? How many of them are incorrect? So here, the state government requires prior approval of the central government as per the new law. Yes. It prohibits setting up of zoos within the forested areas. No. It encourages the setting up of zoos in these forested areas. Eco safaris and so on. Ecotourism is to be promoted. Ensures conservation by limiting the set of activities allowed in the forest land. It in fact allows for more activities to be permitted in the forest land in order to boost tourism and in order to allow for amenities, construction of various amenities in these forested area. So here basically this is also incorrect. So here how many of them are incorrect? You have B, that is 2 of them which are incorrect. Right? I hope there is no doubt in this. Now, after this, moving on to the next question. Basically, with reference to River Cities Alliance, consider the following statements. It was launched by India at Conference of Parties 28 of UNFCCC. International Monetary Fund along with ADB are associated with the associated funding agencies. The alliance is open to all the major river cities across the globe. How many of the above statements is or are correct? So, River Cities Alliance. This was in news. Now here, you can have a significant amount of confusion because a similar name was also in news. Okay, so either you don't know either of those news items, so you are in a ignorance is bliss category. So whatever information you take in, that will be beneficial. But if you have followed the news, at least for the Conference of Parties 28, there is a lot of scope for confusion in this. So please be very mindful and careful of that. So River Cities Alliance, it was launched by India at Conference of Parties of UNFCCC. Is that the correct answer? No. Here, it was launched by India in 2022. India launched Global River Cities Alliance at Conference of Parties. That is a different alliance. So IMF along with ADB are the funding agencies. Incorrect. Alliance is open to all the major river cities across the globe. Again, incorrect. So here, all the 3 are incorrect. So the correct answer is going to be D. That is none of the above. So what is this River Cities Alliance? River Cities Alliance, basically, it was launched to provide the member cities with a platform to discuss and exchange information regarding conservation, best practices for the maintenance of the riverine ecosystem, at the same time ensure that waste is not generated and is discharged into the river, how to keep it in a form of a clean ecosystem. It was initially launched with 30 cities, and various different cities are allowed to participate. So River Cities Alliance, this is India only. Okay. This is associated with India only. Now, at Conference of Parties 28, India took the initiative and launched the Global River Cities Alliance. And this was an initiative by India, which basically included other countries, 9 other countries. So you had India, Denmark, Cambodia, Japan, Bhutan, Australia, Netherlands, Egypt, and Ghana. All of them were the members of this, have become the members of the Global River Cities Alliance. This is also going to play the similar role. Exchange of best practices regarding the preservation of the riverine ecosystem, ensure that it is clean and it is healthy. Okay, so that you can have sustainable development across the banks. So India leads this GRCA with the National Mission for Clean Ganga under the Jal Shakti Ministry, right? And the National Institute for Urban Affairs under Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. So this is the organization which is leading that. Okay. Now, I hope that we are getting the questions correct. How many questions did we actually get correct? At the end of the discussion, write in the comment section below. Not in the live chat, but in the comment section. Consider the following statements about the recently signed Marine Biodiversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, what is also known as BBNJ, or the Treaty of the High Seas. It is a third agreement under UN clause following the formation of International Seabed Authority and Fish Stock Agreement. India has ratified the treaty to ensure conservation of species in the oceans. It aligns with the 30 by 30 target set as per the Kunming-Montreal Agreement. So which of the above statements is or are correct here? So if you take a look at it, the first one, it is a third agreement under UN clause following the formation of International Seabed Authority and Fish Stock Agreement. That is correct. Yes. Ritesh, POP Stockholm and Stockholm 1972, are they the same? No. Stockholm Conference 1972 was a conference on human and environment. Stockholm Convention was signed in 2000s, early 2000s, for a ban on persistent organic pollutants. One is a conference, other is a convention. So both of them are different. So the first statement is correct. India has ratified the treaty to ensure the conservation of species in the oceans. This is incorrect. India has not ratified. As of now, Chile and Palau are the countries which have ratified it. Okay? It aligns with a 30 by 30 target set as per Kunming-Montreal Agreement. So this is a treaty of high seas, conservation of biodiversity into high seas. So automatically the 30 by 30 target of Kunming-Montreal Agreement is what? To bring 30% of the area of the planet under conservation. So it adheres with that. So the third portion is also correct. So the correct answer is going to be C, that is 1 and 3 only. Okay. So when you talk about this treaty of high seas, what do we mean by high seas first of all? So when we talk about the water body, you have to understand that water body is basically delineated from the shoreline based upon what is the usage which can be achieved. So for example, what is considered to be the shoreline, 12 nautical miles from it, that is the territorial water of the country. It is where the jurisdiction of the country is in existence. It is the sovereign space of any particular country. Then after that, you have 12 nautical miles more, which is a contiguous zone, right? Then, and it is outside the territorial portion. But what is important is that from the shoreline, 200 nautical miles is the exclusive economic zone of that particular country. where all the minerals, economic, let's suppose fisheries, they belong to that national resource. Now, beyond this, you have the region which is the high seas, also considered as the area. Now, across the globe, you will observe that all these whitened portions that you see, these are your exclusive economic zones of the country, which maybe the countries can monitor, the countries can conserve, the countries can utilize. But the water bodies beyond that, majority of the water bodies beyond that, they are the high seas. There is no convention on conservation here. That is why UK, US, European Union and China, they were the instrumental countries in negotiating about this Treaty of High Seas. It was arrived in order to bring about a larger amount of conservation. So this is also what is known as the Treaty of High Seas. This was agreed upon last year, and for the conservation of marine biological areas beyond the national jurisdiction. 88 countries have signed, ratified by Chile and Palau. So that is why it has not come into force yet. As per this particular treaty, there will be a separate body which will be set up to implement conservation. Environment impact assessment will be carried out before carrying any commercial activity in the high seas to ensure that there is not a permanent or a long-term damage which is experienced in these high seas. Okay, so the treaty focuses on 4 main areas: conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity, including marine genetic resources, area-based management tools, environment impact assessment, capacity building and transfer of marine technology, for example, underwater exploration, for example, skimmers to separate the waste which generally floats in the dead zones of the oceans, and it seeks to increase the percentage of protected area in the high seas. Presently, it is at a very low number of 1.44%. It is aimed to increase that. Additionally, the aim is to ensure ABS, that is access and benefit sharing, right from the marine genetic resources, and establish the norms for the EIA. But this will happen only after you have 60% of the nations who have ratified this particular treaty. Okay? Now, coming to the next question. With reference to Global Cooling Pledge, consider the following statements. It was initiated by UAE at the Conference of Parties 28 to UNFCCC held in Dubai last year. It commits to the lower rate of warming by inducing the countries to undertake cooling solutions like carbon capture. Led by US, India, Kenya and Canada, 63 countries have already signed on the pledge. Which of these are the correct statements here? Global Cooling Pledge. This was a major outcome of the Conference of Parties 28, which was held on the sidelines of, basically this was held in Dubai. So on the sidelines, you had this pledge which was declared, which was arrived at. It was a major success. 63 countries basically ratified it. So here, as I can see, majority of you have given the incorrect answer. It was initiated by UAE. Yes, because UAE was the host country there. It commits to lower rate of warming by inducing countries to undertake cooling solutions like carbon capture. No. When we talk about this global cooling pledge, so the emissions which is generated by the cooling sector, for example, air conditioners, etc., that has to be reduced. Okay, that contributes to around 7% of the overall greenhouse gas emissions. So if you reduce that, then the global temperatures automatically will be under control, right? So this is incorrect. Led by US, India, Kenya, here India has not signed this particular pledge because India already has got in place India Cooling Action Plan. and India is well on its way to overachieve its target. So that is why India is not a party of this particular pledge. So the correct answer is going to be C, that is 1 only. Okay, so here initiative of the UAE as host of 2023 COP28. Now it aims to raise the overall international cooperation to reduce the emissions by 68% from the present time up till 2050, and increasing access to sustainable cooling by 2030, because as the world is warming up, it is not as if cooling won't be required. Different forms of cooling, sustainable forms of cooling have to be adopted. Increase the global average efficiency of new air conditioners by around 50%, right? 63 countries including US, Canada and Kenya, they signed it. Cooling emissions, they are significantly around 7% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Okay? Yes, now you have more countries which are signing in, Aditi, that is correct. Now, then Belem Declaration, recently in news, is associated with. What is this Belem Declaration? Where is Belem, first of all? Recognizing the importance of indigenous knowledge as a condition for biodiversity conservation, ensure the conservation of peatlands in tropical regions of the world, global action for prevention of smuggling of exotic species, action plan to prevent coastal erosion in small island nations. What is this Belem Declaration about? Very good. Belem is basically the region in Brazil, in the coastal area of Brazil, and there you have the drainage of Para River, which is a part of the larger Amazon River basin. So this particular declaration was arrived at during a meeting of the 8 different countries for the conservation of the Amazon rainforest area. So Belem Declaration was released during the Amazon Summit, and it was for indigenous knowledge, recognizing that indigenous knowledge is an important parameter to propagate any kind of conservation. Globally, whatever conservation has happened, it is largely because of the help of the indigenous and the local population. So there you had indigenous knowledge for biodiversity conservation and ensuring participation of the local community, making them a stakeholder of the conservation process rather than making them an outsider, right? So if you make them stakeholder, that is when conservation will be more long lasting. So what are these countries? So leaders of 8 countries across Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, Peru, Suriname and Venezuela, all of them, they participated in Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization, or ACTO, for the conservation of the Amazon forest. It is on the sidelines of this that Belem Declaration was arrived at. Okay, there was a lot of hue and cry about it, that still you did not have a concrete action plan which was initiated, but nonetheless it does mark a significant step in the process of conservation. Now, consider the following statements about the recently held Brazzaville Summit of 3 basins. It is aimed at the conservation of biodiversity across the 3 vital basins of Amazon, Congo and Ganga-Brahmaputra. A global alliance of member nations across these 3 basins has been created with the aim to empower the local community for conservation. Which of the statements is or are correct? Here. So, when we talk about the Brazzaville Summit of 3 basins, this was in news, so it ended with a declaration. But here, the only difference being that here, rather than Ganga-Brahmaputra, you had another particular river set, that is the Mekong River in the region of South Asia. It was across that where the participation of the local community was sought. Okay, so Ganga Brahmaputra is incorrect. So the first statement basically becomes incorrect. Amazon, Congo and the Mekong Basin. Okay, because that is the tropical rainforest area extending into the region of Indonesia. That is the tropical rainforest area. So there the conservation strategy was thought about, that if we conserve and allow the local community to be a part of the portion of conservation, then across these three river basins where majority of the tropical rainforests are situated, we can ensure maximum amount of conservation. So a global alliance of member nations has been created, allowing the local community to participate in this. So this is correct. So 2 is the correct one in this case. Okay. So basically it was held in Congo, the capital city, that is Brazzaville, and you had Borneo, Mekong in the region of Southeast Asia, Congo and Amazon, where you have a lot of the indigenous population ensuring conservation. You had an action plan, 7-point action plan, which was introduced for basically recognizing the value of cooperation between the three basins, exchange of best practices, recognize that sovereign management of biodiversity, forest and associated resources, develop solutions. So that is about the exchange of ideas, exchange of best practices, include and increase cooperation, empowering the local community in general. Okay. Now, coming to the last question of the day. With regards to enhancing nature-based solution for an accelerated climate transformation, ENACT partnership, consider the following statements. It is led by UNEP and WMO. It was jointly initiated by India and Germany on the sidelines of COP27 meeting of UNFCCC. Which of the above statements is or are incorrect? So if you take a look at this statement, is it led by UNEP and WMO? No. The first statement is incorrect. Then it was initiated by India and Germany? No. It was initiated on the sidelines of COP27 by Germany and Egypt. And this was basically about nature-based solution. What is nature-based solution? Natural solutions which can be used in order to combat climate change, that is natural carbon capture, natural carbon storage, that was to be promoted. So which of the above statements is or are incorrect here? Here C, that is both 1 and 2 are incorrect. So ENACT was launched by Germany and Egypt on the sidelines of COP27. Member nations Canada, European Union, France, Japan, Malawi, Pakistan, Belgium and so on. Okay. Now what are the various nature-based solutions? For example, let's suppose you go for reforestation. For example, let's suppose you go for conservation of oceans. Now, in all these areas, there's a natural absorption and storage and capture of carbon dioxide. So you are not carrying out any reduction of emissions, but what are you doing is basically natural processes are being followed in order to ensure that there is very little amount of carbon left in the atmosphere, carbon compounds, carbon dioxide equivalents. Okay, so that is basically the concept behind nature-based solutions. India has also started focusing upon it. This year, nature-based solutions have been in large number and frequently mentioned in news. So you have to be aware what they are. So afforestation, reforestation programs, maintenance of biodiversity, etc., that can be beneficial. Regenerative agricultural practices, peatland conservation, all those which are natural sinks of carbon, ensure their maintenance. They are your natural, basically, solutions. Why Pakistan indulges in this. Basically, Pakistan has been a recipient of one of the worst climate-induced disasters in 2022 owing to the flood. So after that, they have slightly become much more responsible, at least when it comes to being a part of the coalitions, so that they can ask for the funding whenever required. India is not a party to ENACT. It is, however, implementing its own nature-based solutions. Okay? So that brings us to the conclusion of the session. I hope that the session has been helpful. Today we have completed 3 sessions. Overall, today we have completed close to around 50 questions that we have discussed. This is including the protected areas in use, the various species in use. Today also we have discussed one or two of those important species. Then other than that, the conventions and laws in use. Tomorrow, we shall be discussing other important topics, right? For environment associated with ecosystem. That is also sometimes asked in the examination by UPSC. For example, the concept of habitats, the concept of edge species. That is something which was present in the current affairs. That discussion is purely going to be oriented towards current affairs. There are certain other protected areas which have been in news between the past 12 to 18 months. That is something we shall be taking up in the portion of the marathon session following day after tomorrow. I hope by now you are gaining a confidence amongst yourself that if you are sincere enough, if you are following these sessions regularly, this will be your end-to-end solution for the preparation of prelims examination when it comes to these vital subjects. If you're liking this initiative, please provide us with your blessings in the form of like, share, and the subscribe button. Comment on the video with regards to how many questions did you manage to get it correct. We meet again tomorrow. Till that point of time, revise, take care of yourself, goodbye, and have a good night.